Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video on the natural selection tutorial. This is going to be about um, basically things that can influence evolution, and then we kind of try to explain natural selection. So we're going to be talking about things like genetic variation, natural selection, and environment that all leads to something called adaptations. So the goal here is to try to explain to you how variations appear and what happens with those variations and how they can lead to a change in a population, which can then lead to evolution. And that's a lot, I get it, okay? But stick with me, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. And notice I've jumped ahead to slide 9 here. So we're going to start talking about what we call mechanisms of evolution. These are things that can make evolution happen. Before we do that, we got to get a little bit of history. You've probably heard the phrase survival of the fittest. This is often paired with the theory of natural selection. And I want to be clear about this. Evolution is not a theory. Evolution is considered a scientific, I don't want to say fact, but I want to say standard, okay? But remember that theories attempt to explain phenomena. So evolution is an observed phenomena. We've seen it happen. We see evidence of it happening. Natural selection is a theory to try to explain how evolution occurs, which is what theories do. Theories attempt to explain how phenomena happen, okay? Let me remind you of this because it's going to be on the test at the end of the year. Gravity is not a theory, okay? Now, I've tried to argue with gravity several times in my life, and that's why I can't sleep all night because my back hurts, right? So gravity is not a theory, just like evolution is not a theory. It's a phenomena. It's something that we have observed. However, there are theories about how gravity works. There are theories about how evolution works, and one of them is called natural selection. It says that the best adapted of a population tend to survive their environment, and they have a greater chance of surviving to reproductive age and producing more offspring who are better adapted, and they do this better than those who are less adapted. So if you've got a population, I don't know, pick something here. Let's go with something I know what it is. Let's go with an elephant. If you have a population of elephants, they have slight variations, or maybe mutations have occurred, or something's happened, and in the environment in which they live, there are some that do better than others, okay? Ear size is a big thing with elephants. We'll just use that. Ear size is a big thing with elephants. It allows them to keep cool, okay? You notice that there are two types of elephants, two major types of elephants in the world, those from India and those from Africa. Indian elephants have bigger ears. I think I'm right about this. They have bigger ears that help them stay cool, and that may be the African elephants. I don't know. But one of them have bigger ears because they flap those ears, and a lot of blood flows through those ears to help them cool off, right? So, at some point, a baby elephant was born with slightly bigger ears. We'll call him Dumbo. Now, everybody was, all of the other elephant mommies went over to see the new baby elephant, and they were like, oh, how adorable. When they walked away, they said, geez, did you see the side of the ears on that baby? But that, just because the ugly duckling, which is what Charles Darwin called them, or sports, just because the ugly duckling is not normal doesn't mean it's not best suited for the environment. And that baby elephant, because it had bigger ears, it was allowed to stay cooler. And because it stayed cooler, it struggled less. Because it struggled less, it had more energy, and at the end of the day, it had a greater shot at reproducing. And that's kind of the idea of natural selection, okay? You can see this happen in literally every living organism on Earth. In the latter part of the 19th century, scientists developed theories on evolution to explain the variability in the species. Now remember, the latter part of the 19th century, that's the 1800s, so in the late 1800s, this included the time of Charles Darwin, okay? They come up with several theories to explain evolution, and there were tons of them. Well, I wouldn't say tons, but there were quite a few that came up with evolution was the result of various different things happening. Some things caused it. Nobody really understood genes back then, right? Even Darwin didn't understand genes. Even a guy named Gregor Mendel, who we studied, who was alive at the same time, he didn't know what genes were, although he's the father of genetics. But today we now can know that what drives evolution is a shift in the DNA structure of the organism. But what causes that? What causes the DNA to change from one generation to the next. And so in order to understand that, we got to remember a little bit about DNA. Some traits appear more often than others do. This is the result of what alleles are present in a population. Now, I guess I need to talk to you about that real fast. Can you imagine all of the bass in Lake Okeechobee? That's a population of bass. Is that all the bass in the world? No. That just happens to be all the bass in a given area, geographic area, right? They interact with each other, they reproduce with each other, but they don't interact and reproduce with all the bass in Lake Kissimmee, because there's a 75 mile an hour, or 75 mile, there's 75 miles of land between the two, and, well, maybe not 75, but a lot of land between the two, and they can't migrate except to go up the Kissimmee River, which is a pretty long ways. So there's very little interaction. Therefore, all of the alleles, and alleles are just traits, all the traits that are in Okeechobee, or Lake Okeechobee, for all the bass, that's all the traits that are ever going to be there unless there's mutations or some other stuff, right? So that's what we're going to kind of talk about. And don't forget the idea of dominant and recessive genes, because that has something to do with it too. Now, back in the early 20th century, 1906, two separate scientists named Jeffrey Hardy and Wilhelm Weinberg, we say Weinberg now, they came to the same conclusion about something having to do with genes in a population. Now, keep in mind, this was still this was 40 years after Darwin, 30 years after Darwin, 25 or 30 years after Gregor Mendel. We still didn't know anything about genes, but we did understand about traits and how their traits are inherited. And Hardy and Weinberg both independently came up with an idea that said, unless something changes in a population, unless some outside force changes in the population, then the alleles that are present in that population, like the bass in Lake Okeechobee, won't change. The ratio won't change. If it's 55% this and 35% or 45% that, that won't ever change from one generation to the next. They called this the Hardy-Weinberg principle. And so now we kind of look at evolution as, okay, well, there's no population that's in what we call equilibrium. All populations are slightly changing. But Hardy-Weinberg tells us how populations don't change. So now we look for things that violate the Hardy-Weinberg principle. This was brilliant on their part. So when we talk about evolution and we talk about changes in population, we talk about what causes a change in the Hardy-Weinberg ratios. Now for some math. And yes, you need to learn this math because you're going to be asked to do a problem like this on a quiz and a test. Don't make it too hard. Okay, let me show you how it works. If we have pea plants, here's some pea plants. You'll notice that there are 3 different colors. Now we pick these pea plants because in this case, if you remember, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a homozygous dominant and a heterozygous, because they both show the dominant trait. But in this case, we can see that purple is the dominant trait. So if you're purple, you're a big T, big T. If you're light purple, you're big T, little t. And if you are white, you're little t, little t. Now this is what we call incomplete dominance, and you may want to go back and review that. But it's nice for us to talk about these pea plants because now we can literally tell if it is heterozygous, homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive. Okay, and the T's are the alleles. That stands for a dominant and a dominant. This plant right here that has this purple flower has 2 dominant traits, one from mom, one from dad, dominant and dominant. This plant here that's white has 2 recessive traits, one from mom, one from dad, recessive, recessive. The light purple ones have one of each, a dominant and a recessive. We don't know where they came from, which parent, but one is dominant, one's recessive. Now this is nice because now it allows us to count. Okay, and now we made up a kind of a fictitious little garden here, but if there are 100 pea plants, all right, then I have 200 traits because each pea plant has one from mom, one from dad. So I have 200 alleles, okay? And this is called allele frequency. And so we're going to count the alleles. Each plant has 2 alleles. I've got 100 plants, 200 alleles. That's easy, right? Now, if I've got 45 plants that are dominant for flower color, then I've got 90 big T's, right? That's not hard to get. If I've got 20 plants that are recessive, they've got lowercase, then I've got 40 lowercase t's, right? And if I've got 35 plants that are heterozygous, then I got 35 big T's and 35 little t's. And so now we can add all those up. 45 big T's, but do that twice because these have 2. That's 90 plus these 35 right here. That gives me 125 dominant alleles. Okay, and I've got 20 plants, 2 each, so that's 40 plus these 35 gives me 75 lowercase alleles, right? Now, one way you'll know you do this right is if it adds up to 100. I mean, sorry, to 200. Okay. So what is my ratio? Well, I've got 125 out of 200 dominants, so that's a 0.625, and I've got 75 out of 200 recessives, so that's 0.375, and yeah, you can use a calculator on this. So that gives me a 62.5% to a 37.5% ratio. Now, folks, if you guys are struggling with that, go back and review this page and just rewind in what I told you, because the way I just told you is perfect, all right? It is all right here. Remember, probably if you are confused, you're confused because you're forgetting to double it. Every plant has 2 traits, and if they're all dominant, then I have 2 dominant traits. Okay, if they're all recessive, I have 2 recessive traits. And so if I have 20 plants with 2 recessive traits, that's a total of 40 recessive traits. Okay, and then the heterozygous have 1 of each. So I have 35 heterozygous plants and I have 35 dominants and 35 recessives to add together. And all we're trying to do is find out how many dominant and recessives there are. But then you come up with your frequency. Now, the Hardy-Weinberg principle says that if I have a field of these, okay, and they all reproduce with each other, and no new seeds come in, no new pollen comes in, nothing leaves, no crazy stuff happens to it, the population is in a state of what we call equilibrium, which is a theoretical state. It never happens. But it says that from one generation to the next for eternity, this ratio will never change. Okay? And we teach you all this because I need you to know that when we study evolution, and specifically natural selection, we're looking at things that cause a change in this Hardy-Weinberg frequency. Just so you know, what we calculated on the previous page, I'm going to go back, is the phenotype frequency. Okay, we just kind of predicted what they will look like. We can actually predict what's called the genotype frequency, or how many homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessives there are using this formula. Now, this is nothing more than the sum of the sum of a square. It's squares. Yeah, it's this. P plus Q squared, okay, where P is the ratio of the dominant allele and Q is the ratio of the recessive allele. Okay, we add those together, square it, equals 1, or we can FOIL that out. Now, I know you guys took algebra. We can FOIL that out. P plus Q times P plus Q is going to be P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. This is a very easy, I mean, if you've done algebra, you should recognize that. You can change P for X and Q for Y and you get the same thing, right? So the homozygous dominant ratio plants are all the P squared value, the homozygous recessives are the Q squared value, and the heterozygous are the 2PQ. So if we actually plugged in our numbers, 0.625 for P and 0.375 for Q, and we put it into this equation, we can actually calculate out the ratios of homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous, and that should add up to 1. Now, this is a little bit complex. It's not that hard. If they make you do it on the test, just write this formula right here down. That's all you got to do. And remember that this is the Weinberg, the ratio that we got on Hardy-Weinberg for P. This is the ratio for Q, and this is 2PQ. And just put it in there and do the math. It's not that difficult. Maybe even write down this example, or take a picture of this page. I don't know. It's not that difficult. I would never make you do this because I think this is college level stuff, but I don't make this up. So go through it. But what I really want you to do is to understand that we can use math, we can use statistics to predict a lot of things about a population. The main thing I want you to get is that disrupting the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is what causes evolution. That's the main thing I want you to get out of this, okay? But I would like for you to be able to calculate it. And so, here is an assignment in which you are asked to do it. So what I really want you guys to do is just calculate that first page, the easy one, okay? Tell me the ratio of dominant to recessive alleles, okay? So if 40 plants are homozygous dominant, then that's 40 big T's, 44 big T little t's, and 16 little t's. Now you just add them up and find the ratio. That's all I need you to do here. Okay. So the first thing that violates Hardy-Weinberg, that disrupts the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, is something called genetic drift. Now, genes are like the underlying mechanism of all of natural selection and evolution. So everything we look at is going to kind of be through the eyes of genes. But genetic drift is the idea that there's something random that causes a change in the frequency. For instance, if you're to do a frequency comparison of this population, you've got some reds, some pinks, and some blues. But if there is a particular type of predator, such as a bird that can only see the blues, for some reason, maybe the environment is predominantly red, and I guess it's really purple, but then they would eat the purples more often than they would the rest of these. So the next generation becomes more red and blue. So the ratio of purple, did I say red and blue? Just pretend you know what I'm talking about. The ratio of blue to pink to red is drastically changed because all the blues are eating purples. And so now we have a lot more pinks and reds, and that changed the frequency of the alleles in the population. Remember, this is just a population. This isn't all of them. This is just a population. And so this population now has a different ratio than it did before, and that is a change in Hardy-Weinberg, and that can lead to evolution. Another thing is called the founder effect. You've got all these different colored ladybugs. They're all cool colored ladybugs, but only a few actually leave this population to go settle a new area. They didn't take the same ratio of colors with them. They only took a few. It's called the founder effect. So only the blues and the purples went to the new area to populate it. So guess what? All of the ratio there is blue and purple. So compare this ratio, what it is now, to what it was previously, and you can see there was a change in the allele ratio, and that again violates Hardy-Weinberg. The bottleneck effect is similar. It's caused by some type of event, something, who knows, but in a lot of cases it's something catastrophic, and so the catastrophe just randomly kills, various members of the population. So the only ones that survive are the ones that now create the new ratio, and it changes the equilibrium, and this pushes them towards evolving away from the rest of the population, which is, remember, this is just a population. This isn't all of the ladybugs. It's just a group of them, and something happened. Maybe the farmer sprayed a field, and all of the light blue, dark blue, and purple ones were on this side that he sprayed, and these, they were off, I don't know, sleeping or something, and they didn't get sprayed, and so now the next generation is just this. Now, the overall population, or all the rest of the populations, didn't get affected, but this one did. And that's important to remember, because this is now pushing this group towards evolving into a different species than the rest of the population. And that's what evolution is creation of a new species. So what we're really looking at here is, how do we get a new species? Whenever you think of gene flow, just think of flow as movement of the genes. Okay, so whenever organisms migrate, they take with them their genes. So if you think of all of the bass in Lake Okeechobee, if 20 bass decide to migrate over to Lake Istapoga, then they're taking with them their genes. Okay, and this changes both populations. It changes the population, or the ratio of genes in the population of Lake Okeechobee and the ratio of genes in the population of Lake Istapoga. And so that then changes the ratios, which then can lead to evolution. Now, it takes a lot of gene flow to make this happen, but it's one of the mechanisms. All right. One thing about gene flow is good, by the way, but one thing about it is it's kind of weird. Even when bees get pollen out of them and then travel a very long distance, that's another form of gene flow. Mutations, to me, mutations are the main thing that direct evolution, because they create new traits, and these new traits have never been seen before, and so these new traits generally are bad. Generally, almost all the time, mutations are bad. They kill you. If they don't kill you, they give you a negative adaptation, or a negative trait that causes you to perform poorly in the environment, but very rarely, and I mean, we're talking like a really rare thing here, but very rarely a new trait shows up, and that trait can then become something that is a beneficial trait. Whatever environment you're in, it's beneficial. Now, here's the thing about traits. All traits are beneficial, or all traits are bad, depending on the environment. Being tall can be a benefit, or it can be a detriment depending on the environment you're in. If you're living in a forest with very tall trees, you know, the taller you are, the more chance you have of doing well, because you can hunt more or move more, or, you know, grab things off top of trees. But suppose you live in caves. I would imagine that being tall is a detriment to living in caves. So after a while, the shorter members of the species tend to do better. And so guess what? Guess what would happen? Suppose there was a population of tall and short organisms, and half the population live in the trees, and the other half of the population lives in the caves. After a while, you can imagine that it wouldn't take but 10, 15, 20 generations before the ones that live in the trees are generally taller than the ones that live in the caves. And this is just, this is what happens overall. Now, those aren't necessarily mutations, but, you know, you can imagine that a mutation occurs and causes, I don't know, organisms to have purple eyes or blue hair or something. And if that purple eyes or blue hair gives you an advantage, then it sticks around. Okay, and that's just a mutation. Another thing that affects the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is when mating is not random. One thing that Hardy-Weinberg assumes is that there's nothing to impede mating, that it can happen absolutely randomly, and that rarely happens. Most of the time, well, most of the time there's something that affects how genes are exchanged. Now, we always think about humans in this case, but, you know, we should be thinking about animals and plants and fungus, you know, and you know, with some plants it's random because of the way the wind blows. But if you have pollinating insects or birds, then that does have an effect. It no longer becomes random, because now it becomes who has the best flower. And so when species mate, generally, especially animals, they generally don't just randomly mate. There is some type of characteristic that they seek out in their mate, and that is non-random mating, and as a result, that decreases genetic diversity, because there are organisms that are less likely to mate and organisms that are more likely to mate, simply because of their characteristics. And this can actually lead to all kinds of things, including inbreeding. And inbreeding is not uncommon. If you think inbreeding is silly or funny, don't look at your dog, because every species of dog on Earth is inbred. That's how we get new species of organisms, or cats, or horses, or cows. And so inbreeding is very common, and it decreases genetic diversity, and it violates Hardy-Weinberg. But, you know, it is what it is. But that can lead to evolution, because certain traits, in certain of the non-desirable traits, are disappearing, leaving the desirable traits only. And remember, traits are only desirable depending on the environment. So if you have a population move to a new environment, whatever traits were successful in the old environment may not be successful in the new environment. That's just, you know, that's just the way it works. So now we actually start talking about natural selection, and we break it up into several types. So we're going to be looking at 3 types of selection that have to do with adjusting the population towards particular traits. For instance, the first one is called disruptive selection. Now, if I were teaching this, I would have taught it third, but whatever. So the blue graph represents the population of organisms, and it shows them based on traits. So right here in the middle in this blue graph shows the average trait, and most members of a population have that average trait. Then the further you go to the left, the more extreme you get in one way, and the further you go to the right, the more extreme you get in the other way. In this case, it would be color. The more you go to the left, the more red the butterfly becomes. The further you go to the right, the more yellow the butterfly becomes. And in the middle, there's some combination of red, yellow, orangish kind of thing. Now, this blue graph represents how the population is until something changes. Okay, and we're no longer really kind of focused on Hardy-Weinberg here, but this would be something that comes in and disrupts the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And in this case, it's something that kills the middle trait. Maybe it's an animal that, you know, a bird or some type of predator that can see this color better. Maybe the environment has changed to where a new type of flower moves in, and what used to be orange flowers that these things hid better on is now turned into, I don't know, blue flowers, or I don't know. There's all kinds of possibilities here. But what happens is that now something starts heavily predating on only this particular trait. And over time, you have less and less of these and more of the extreme traits. So after a while, you get a population that has a lot of reds and a lot of yellows, but very few of the in between. And it's not that hard to see that after a while, this number could dip lower and lower and lower until you have 2 separate species, a red one and a yellow one. and this is called disruptive selection. It takes a while for it to occur, has to have some kind of a crazy event that, that predates on the middle characteristic, but it's called disruptive selection. Okay. Directional selection is very simple. You have a trait. Here is the original graph, the blue graph, and you had this moth that was this colored. It was called a peppered moth, and it was white with black specks on it. It looks like pepper. However, during the Industrial Revolution, before the Industrial Revolution, the lichens that grew on trees in England or in Europe were roughly this colored, and so it gave these moths a place to hide. They were harder to be found by predators such as birds, and so as a result they could hide. But however, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of coal burned. The coal would then kind of just stick to the trees, and the moss would no longer be this color. It turned darker. So guess what? Over time, the population shifted to becoming darker. Now this isn't covered in soot. This is its natural color, but imagine that the trees are now darker. This thing stands out like a sore thumb. So anytime there is a moth that is born slightly darker, then the population tends to go towards that. You can imagine that moths were born lighter and darker before the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't do very well because they were easy to be seen on the lichens. But when the color of the lichens changed because they were covered with all the soot, now the most advantageous color is the darker color. So when these moths were born or hatched, where they are, and they're darker, they're the ones that were more successful, and over time the population moved from here to here, or it moved directionally towards a different trait. That's what directional selection is. Stabilizing selection is the idea that the extreme traits tend to be a negative, and so the surviving members tend to bunch around the middle trait, and the middle trait becomes more popular over time. One thing that we've noticed, and this is kind of gruesome, sorry, but it's the example they gave, is that birth weight in babies tends to center around a certain size in a population, because the lower the birth weight of humans, the less likely they are to survive, and then the higher the birth weight, the more likely they are to be damaged or die during birth because of difficulties in moving out of the, in being born. And so there is an ideal birth weight in humans, and as a result, you get the ones that survive tend to survive around that ideal birth size. And so over time, because that's a trait, and so over time the population tends to have babies of a certain trait. It's called stabilizing selection. It stabilizes around the middle trait and avoids the extremes, the lower or the higher extremes. Another type of selection, there's not a picture of it here. I think I'll find a picture of a peacock just to show you. It's kind of a cruddy picture, but you can see that these are two birds. This is the peahen and this is the peacock. And sexual selection can be found here because, well, let me tell you a quick story. Darwin said peacocks make him sick. He couldn't explain them. And for the longest time, he couldn't explain how such a garish, hideous creature, well, not hideous, it's beautiful, but to him it was hideous because he couldn't explain it. These are found in India. And in India, these are birds get eaten. Tigers hunt these things down and eat them. If that's the case, how come this thing that is so visible is still around? And he couldn't explain it until he hit upon the idea of sexual selection. Now here's the deal, okay? And we all fall for this, believe it or not, but here's the deal. This peahen is looking for a mate. This peacock is trying to convince her to become his mate. Therefore, he displays this unbelievable plumage. And here's what it says to the peahen. It says, if I can still be alive and look like this, I must have some really good intelligence. I must be really smart and be able to avoid being eaten by tigers. And so the peahen falls for it and says, that makes sense. All this big plumage now says that not only are you, have this unbelievable size of feathers, but you can avoid being eaten by tigers. And over time, we don't think that way, because humans do this too. We don't think that way. We just think, oh my God, that's beautiful, right? And this happens in all animal species. All animal species has sexual selection in which the coloring is attractive to the females for the very reason of that if you are able to look this ridiculous, you must be good at something else, and that's a trait that they're looking for. So think about that the next time you look for a guy that rides a motorcycle. All right. So a little bit about the nuts and bolts of natural selection and adaptations. An adaptation is a characteristic or behavior that helps an organism to survive in its environment. Adaptations can occur as a result of natural selection. So natural selection picks for the traits that work best. Okay, I'm going to tell you something absolutely insane. This is a what is this? A seal? Seals used to be wolf-like creatures that lived on land. Now look at that. Look at that face. Look at those eyes. Okay, look at the shape of the body. It's not that hard to believe. I mean, if you had a Play-Doh shape of a dog, it wouldn't be too hard to shape that into a seal, right? So the idea is that adaptations occurred over time. You can imagine that a dog, a wolf-like creature, lived next to the water and started hunting in the water, and over a long period, thousands of generations, the ones that were born with traits that gave it a better shot at hunting in the water are the ones that survived. And so over a while, legs turned into flippers, and flippers are very good, help it move around. If you look at the skeleton of this and compare it to a dog, it's very similar. Just a quick reminder that adaptations can either be adapt to the abiotic factors such as temperature, climate, type of landscape. They can also adapt to biotic factors such as being preyed upon by predators. So they have to become camouflaged. And so there are two kind of ways of types of adaptation. So we look at adaptations on whether or not they change the structure of the organism. This is a physical change in the body, coloring, shape, even a radical change in the shape of the limb or whatever. This can occur in plants. Plants that grow in a hot, dry desert have thicker stems and leaves that store water. That's a structural change. Functional changes are changes to the internal system. How do they maintain homeostasis? How do they perform necessary life functions? How do they attract pollinators? Okay, do they let out a scent that attracts certain pollinators? Spiders produce venom to kill prey. These are all functional adaptations. How does the body function? And finally, there's behavioral, and these are kind of hard to believe, but these are genetic. And behavioral adaptations are changes in the way a creature behaves to survive in the environment. For example, migration, hibernation, herding instincts. These are all behaviors that are genetic. Birds migrate to warmer climates in the winter to avoid freezing to death, and that is a genetic adaptation. How did all that happen? Over time, the ones that figured out to migrate, for example, were the ones that were more successful. So adaptation is a good thing. Let's talk about some benefits. These are just some examples, but in extreme conditions, to be able to maintain homeostasis, think about a desert. This is a really hot, dry environment, and yet plants thrive there. And the only reason they thrive there is because they adapted to it. All right, cacti plants have spines instead of leaves, and the spine does various things. One is it protects the plant from being eaten. Two is that it can it makes less surface area for water to evaporate, so the plant can hang on to its water better. Okay, take a look at this owl. Every bit of structure about this owl, it seems, is to be able to do exactly what it's doing right here, to be able to fly and grab something to eat. When a bat sends out sound waves from their mouths and they can hear it, it had to adapt to create specialized vocal cords that send out the sound and the ears that retrieve the sound. These are adaptations. Here's one of my favorites, although I hate snakes, is, first of all, just look at the coral snake. Why in the world would you be colored like this? Well, these colors in nature tend to suggest to a predator, don't mess with me, I'm poisonous, I will hurt you. See, the coral snake is venomous, but the best defense is to just tell everybody, hey, don't mess with me, I'm dangerous. So it comes up with this coloring. So that's one adaptation. But here's an interesting thing. This is a king snake. King snakes are colored. They're not dangerous. They don't have venom, but they look similar. So this is called mimicry in the case of the king snake. The king snake is mimicking the coloring of the coral snake because this says, don't mess with me. I look like the coral snake, and coral snakes will kill you, so don't mess with me, because and it keeps it alive. This is just another example of adaptation. Flowers are a great example of adaptation. It helps the plant to reproduce better because it attracts the pollinators, or it gives it the ability to self-pollinate. So there's lots of adaptations that go on that are beneficial. Even behaviors like reproduction can be modified heavily depending on adaptations to the environment. And there are two types of reproductive strategies. It's called K and R. The K strategists, organisms that are K-type strategists, are ones that don't want to overshoot the carrying capacity of the environment, so they don't have that many offspring. Therefore, they have adjusted their behavior to where, in their structures and everything, to where they're able to further nurture their few offspring. Basically, K selection strategists have few offspring and nurture them and care for them, hoping that they'll survive and thrive. The R types strategists, the R selection strategists, heck with that. We're just gonna have a bunch of babies. They're good luck. And surely if I have 1,000 offspring, one of them will survive. That would be the example of this thistle. And you can think about that in pretty much every organism is either an R or a K. Humans are a K because we don't have that many children, and we hope that they all survive. Whereas, like think about Finding Nemo, right? The two clownfish didn't have just two offspring; they had thousands of offspring. Now, the dark secret there is that they did not expect them all to survive, and we kind of tend to add our way of thinking towards the clownfish. But trust me, when the clownfish have thousands of fish, they do not expect all 1,000 of them to survive. That's the R-type strategy. Again, that is an adaptation. In both cases, they're successful, but for different reasons. Which one's easier, which one's harder? They both have their goods and bads. But it seems like K-types tend to become more successful over time in terms of adaptations. Well, I shouldn't even say that. In terms of development, the R strategists tend to be much more simpler organisms. You don't see a complex organism like a human or an elephant or a dolphin having thousands of offspring just in the hopes that one survive. So K-type, and that may be because we're humans looking at it because we're K-type too, but K-type strategists tend to be more complex organisms. This chart compares the R and the Ks. The lifespan of the R strategist is short versus long for the Ks. There's very little parental care or involvement after fertilization for the Rs, whereas the Ks tend to nurture, protect, carry, then nurture, then protect the child or the offspring until it's grown. The R strategist, the growth rate of the population tends to be rapid, whereas in K it's slow. The body size tends to be small in Rs but large in Ks. The organisms mature rapidly in Rs but mature slowly in Ks. The reproductive rate is high. I've already told you that in Rs versus Ks. The surviving pattern, and this is what's important, the surviving pattern due to predation and environmental factors is low for the Rs, but they know that, whereas in Ks they have most of their offspring reach adulthood. Insects, frogs, oysters, they have thousands of offspring. They don't expect all of them to survive, whereas elephants, monkeys, whales, humans, dogs, cats, this kind of thing, they only have a few offspring at a time. And I know you think, well, my dog just had 6 puppies. Yeah, but that's still small compared to like frogs and insects and oysters. These things will lay thousands of eggs at a time. Again, are there R's on Earth? Yes, they must be successful. Are there K's alive today? Yes, they must be successful. Which one is better? I don't know. It just seems like these tend to be more complex, and that's about the only thing I can say. So this leads us to an idea of genetic diversity. How do we get all these different genetically different things on Earth? I mean, not only are humans, for example, very genetically diverse, but we are but one species in millions of types of species, and all of that leads to diversity. My brother and I, as I've told you before, my brother and I are probably the two most similar to each other. My brother's probably the most similar genetically to me on Earth, even more similar to me than my children or my parents. But we even have differences. We had the same two parents, and we were born within a couple of years of each other. And we do have a lot of similar characteristics, but there are differences. We are not the same. And so diversity is important. And it's diversity that leads to success. And this is something it's crucial. One thing that we notice when we look everywhere in the living kingdom is that the most successful organisms on earth are also the most diverse. So we should look at that and take a lesson from that, and that diversity is something to be celebrated. When we look around and we see all kinds of different trees and all kinds of different plants and animals and this and that, and this is important for us to see that this genetic diversity creates a healthy ecosystem. And what does it have to do with natural selection? Natural selection gives us genetic diversity. It helps us to they kind of go hand in hand. Because there's a genetic diversity, then there is a lot of different possible offspring, and the strongest will survive. Okay, so when nature selects, it has a lot to select from, right? Taller giraffe does better than the shorter giraffe. The peacock with the bigger feathers does better than the peacock with the shorter feathers, and they may even be brother and sister. But genetic diversity is what helps with evolution, because it gives the nature, and I know that I'm making nature sound like it's a living, or it's a thinking thing, but it's not. But when nature wants to pick the best traits, the more traits that it has to pick from, the better chance it's going to have of picking the best trait, I guess is the best way to put it. Of course, this then leads to more diversity because of the idea of reproduction being successful creates and fosters these new traits and spreads them around even more. So that when organisms move from one environment to another, or the environment it changes, the one they're in changes, there's a greater chance of the species not going extinct. Extinction is the opposite of evolution. Okay, and so take a look at these two mice. Not too many generations ago, they may have been from the same species, but because some started living in a browner area versus a tan area versus a darker or lighter, whatever color you want to call it, they started to adapt in their colors and a couple of other things. You can't tell, but the tail on this guy is a little bit furrier. So the thing, being able to adapt to these new environments or to changing environments is what it's all about. Otherwise, everything would go extinct. But because this process works, because it creates new traits, these traits then create new species over time, we can look around and see all of this unbelievable genetic diversity. And it's amazing. I love diversity. Imagine if there was only one type of horse or one type of animal. Imagine if there's only one type of tree, for example. I think a pine tree is one of the most amazing looking trees there is. But if every tree was a pine tree, it wouldn't be that special. So we have diversity. Evolution leads to diversity. Evolution creates new species, and it's because of natural selection. So what are some things that increase genetic diversity? One of the main ones is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual. Remember, asexual reproduction is one organism splitting in half and becoming two. Each one of them is a clone from each other. Asexual reproduction is fast. It requires very little energy, but it also gives very little diversity. So there's some goods and some bads. Sexual reproduction is slow, takes a ton of energy, but the result is a genetically diverse population. So sexual reproduction is one of the biggest factors to increasing genetic diversity. Genetic mutations mutations create new traits. These new traits these new traits, they appear and they may or may not be successful, but that it gives even more diversity. The more new traits you have, the more genetic diversity you're going to have. Migration moves these traits around, and then population sizes gives you a greater chance of successful mate that is unrelated. The larger the population size, the greater chance you're going to have at having a mate that is genetically diverse from you. Okay, you have small population sizes, there's going to be a lot of inbreeding, and that inbreeding reduces genetic diversity, but it happens all the time. So And so remember me telling you that endangered or extinction is the opposite of evolution. Evolution creates species, extinction removes species. And extinction is important. Natural selection says this is the trait that we want. This is the trait that works best for this environment, this ecosystem. If you don't have that trait, then you should disappear. And sometimes, most of the times that just means individuals, but sometimes that means entire species go extinct because the environment has changed and they're no longer an important part of the ecosystem. They no longer function well in the ecosystem. They should be removed. Here's an interesting fact: 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are extinct. That suggests that extinction is common. It is normal. It is supposed to happen. Okay. Now, when species go extinct today because humans do it, that's a problem. But remember that long before humans showed up, extinction was happening left and right. So extinction is important. It's an important part of evolution and natural selection. Some things that can cause extinction is a low genetic diversity. When a population gets too small, or the population inbreeds too much, or for whatever reason the genetic diversity gets low, there is a great danger of that population disappearing, going extinct. So low genetic diversity. Now that is normal. That can happen without humans. Okay, and I guess all these can to some degree happen without humans, but humans can cause this as well, such as if you have a lot of hunting occur on any particular species, then you can reduce the genetic diversity, which can lead to extinction. Habitat destruction is another one. Yes, it occurs naturally, but humans are very good at destroying habitats, and so that causes organisms to struggle. It causes a lot of organisms in the population to die, and that reduces genetic diversity. Habitat fragmentation is similar to habitat destruction. In habitat fragmentation, humans build something such as a canal or a road or a power line or something that breaks one big habitat into two or more smaller ones, and it restricts the movement of an organism. And so what was one big population with a huge diversity is now two separate populations with a much smaller diversity, so less genetic diversity there. Pollution can kill off a lot of the organisms. Less organisms means less diversity. Invasive species such as we're having in South Florida are an example of an ecosystem that was healthy, but a new species moves in. There's no predators to control this species, and it takes over. It takes away the nutrients and resources for the existing population, and they start to give away and slowly die off, and that can lead to an extinction. And finally, exploitation, and this is one that is uniquely to humans. Any of these other things can happen naturally, but this is one that's uniquely to humans, and that is when we overuse a natural resource. It's okay to go fishing, but if you fish too much, then you're causing genetic diversity problems. It's okay to go hunting, but when you hunt too much, you're causing problems with genetic diversity. It's okay to farm the land, but when you farm the land too much, you can be causing problems with genetic diversity. We're already seeing huge issues with wild fish populations that are overfished. We're seeing their population numbers reduce, and we're seeing their genetic diversity suffer immensely. So all of that can lead to extinction. Now, natural extinction is normal, but human-led extinction is not, and it creates a real problem. Okay, that ends the tutorial on natural selection. Hopefully you got an idea of what causes natural selection. Go back and review Hardy-Weinberg. Go back and review what natural selection is and how it how it affects adaptations. We just talked about it, but do it again for genetic diversity, and you're all set. All right, get to work.